Hey guys, this is Peter from MyJewelryBench.com. Today we're going to be working on replacing the mainspring on a Rolex Submariner. Okay, so what we're going to do to start is, I'm not actually going to take the movement out of the case. We're just going to take the parts that we need to take out just to get to the mainspring barrel. This watch was serviced recently, but whoever did the service didn't change the mainspring, and I don't even think they even looked at it. So we're going to start by unscrewing the mainspring winder. You can see here I'm loosening the two screws that hold this 3150 in place. This auto winder, I could probably take the flywheel out, but you don't have to. Just be very careful with it. Get the two screws out and put them in the parts tray, and gently lift up on the winder. Next, we'll take out the balance wheel and balance cock. There's two screws that hold this in place. Loosen both screws, put them in the parts tray. Now just be careful when you pull out the balance cock with the spring attached to it. You don't want to do any damage. The next part is to remove the pallet arbor and the pallet plate. So we're going to loosen the two screws, take those out. That loosens up the plate, and then we'll remove the pallet fork from the movement. If there's any tension on the mainspring at this point, once we remove the pallet fork, you're going to see that it's starting to wind down. I'm going to hold it with my finger very gently, take the pallet fork out, and just let it wind down. Now I'm going to release the mainspring winding gear. There's one screw that holds that in place. So we're going to take that out, put the screw and that little ratchet gear aside. There's two screws that hold the plate, the mainspring plate, onto the watch movement. Remove both these screws. Make sure you keep them in the parts tray. Remember what I told you about when you're holding the tweezers, you want to be very, very gentle with these screws because they will pop out and fly across the room. Now we're going to remove that plate, put that with the two screws. The next step is to remove the mainspring barrel. So now we have full access to the mainspring barrel. It's sitting in a little pocket. So what you want to do is release it from the pocket, and then once it's released from the pocket, in this case because it's in the watch movement itself, we're just going to shake it out. It's not going to do any damage. Now, your mainspring comes apart. There's three pieces plus the spring. You can see I'm tapping very gently on the mainspring barrel to release the cap. I always do this with my hand and a small, soft brass hammer. The next thing is to remove the cap from the barrel. Very important here, once you remove the cap, I want you to note how the mainspring winds into the watch. So in this case, from outside to in, it winds counterclockwise. And that's how we're going to have to put it back in. Some mainsprings run clockwise. So always check the direction that the mainspring winds in. Now we're going to gently remove the mainspring arbor from the mainspring itself. Now, this mainspring isn't in that bad a shape, but this mainspring is the original, and it has never been cleaned or serviced, never been changed. So judging by the age of the watch, it's over 10 years old. We're going to remove the spring carefully. We don't want it to fly across the room. Sometimes if the spring gets out of your hands, the barrel actually flies across, or you could lose it. So be careful when you do this. You want to gently wind it, and you can see I alternate it from one hand to another, letting the spring just wind around my fingers. It's a good time to examine the spring. Sometimes if it's a newer watch, I'll clean and polish the spring and reuse it if it can be reused. In this case, we're just going to replace it. Now notice the inside of the barrel. All the dirty, dried grease that unfortunately nobody's ever looked at. So yeah, this is a good candidate. Customer's complaint was that the watch was running a few minutes slow per week. When I ran it on the tester, it was running about 7.5 minutes slow a week. So since the watch is pretty clean, obviously it's the mainspring. So I'm going to clean these in the ultra center cleaner. So take the three parts, the arbor, the cap, and the barrel, put them in a cleaning basket, throw it in the ultra center cleaner for about 10 minutes, brush. Okay, so using a mainspring winder, you can see on the post of the winder, there is a winding pin. And if you look at the mainspring in the corner, you can see there's a little hole in the mainspring. That little hole has to fit onto that pin and get wound in the correct direction when using the mainspring winder. And you'll see by the next part of the video how I use that to get it into the mainspring winder and then put it into the barrel. Okay, so you can notice here that I have the mainspring and the center hole of the mainspring onto the pin in the mainspring winding arbor. Now this is going to go into the mainspring winder, and we're going to turn it so that it winds around that arbor. Now in this part of the video, I wanted to show you that it can be kind of tricky to wind a spring, especially a smaller watch spring, because wristwatch springs, they're just as powerful as mainsprings in some cases, and because they're so small and my fingers are a little large here, you can see how I'm holding it with both sets of fingers trying to wind it in place. Occasionally, if you lose your grip, the mainspring can pop out of the arbor and then kind of fly across the room. So this happened to me twice while I was doing this watch, and I wanted to show you both times because it happens to all of us. I've been doing this for 21 years. So if you're new to this, don't be surprised if you lose a mainspring out of the winding system, because it's going to happen. And mainspring winders are, you know, they're really good, and I'm using a rather older one that's treated me very good. But you have to be very careful when you pull out this winding arbor, and there you have it. It can pop right out of that thing. So if that happens, just pick it up, make sure it's cleaned, re-oil it. I always pre-oil the mainspring when I put it in there, and you'll see that obviously it's no longer in the winder. Again, we're going to try a second time, and I get the little pin into the mainspring center hole, and then we start winding the spring. This is my second attempt, and I've cleaned the spring again and re-oiled it. And like I said, I like to pre-oil my springs just because that way I don't have to oil them separately once they're in the barrel. And you can see that one just kind of popped right out. For some reason it didn't wind well, so don't worry about it. It's going to happen. Try not to damage the mainspring. Once you damage that mainspring, it's no good, and you'll have to get another one. Some mainsprings can cost in excess of $80 for some of the Swiss watches, so keep that in mind when you're replacing a mainspring. Here you can see that everything's getting ready to be wound again. This is my third attempt, and the third time was a charm. So I grabbed the arbor. I'm going to make sure it's the right one I want, and it looks good. It's fitting perfectly. I'm going to put the arbor into the mainspring and get the center hole aligned with the pin. Once it's aligned correctly, I'm just going to gently wind it. This time I'm going to hold it a little bit more firm so that I don't lose control of that winding arbor. If you do this once or twice and they pop out, don't worry. It happens to everybody. Now, some of the winders that are on the market, I'll put some links in the video as well as on the blog post. You can go take a look at those. They can get rather expensive, but if you're going to do this for a living, you want really good mainspring winders. Now, I'm using an inexpensive one here, and the reason I'm using an inexpensive one here is because most of you taking this course, you're not watchmakers by profession, and this might be a hobby. And sometimes spending $300 on a mainspring winder can seem rather daunting. Now here I was having a little bit of trouble getting that center hole onto the pin, and that does happen occasionally. The reason we use a winder to wind a mainspring is because it keeps the coil correct, and we are going to cause almost no tension damage to the spring. Some people will show you that you can insert a mainspring by hand into a mainspring barrel, and yes, you can. But the chances are you're going to damage that spring as much as 30% of its tension level. So you don't want to do it by hand if you don't have to. If it's your own watch and you don't care and you want to wind it by hand just to see how it works, then you can alleviate the need to have a mainspring winder. But trust me, a mainspring winder is going to make the mainspring wind better, last longer, with fewer issues. Now once I've got the mainspring into the winder using the winding arbor, now I have to get the arbor off without the spring popping off, and I'll use plastic flat tools, or in this case I'm going to use a razor blade to gently get that pin out of the mainspring hole so I can take the arbor out. I don't recommend using a razor blade, you can cut yourself, but it does work, and you can see here now the mainspring's in the winder, and we'll go on to the next step, which is inserting this into the barrel. If you've got it all set correctly and the winder fits inside the barrel, you should be able to insert this mainspring with very little issue. So you can see here I'm just getting the little tab, the end of the mainspring, pushed into the barrel. On the top of this particular mainspring winder there's a push pin, and we're going to push down on it. When we push down on it, it's going to push the spring into the barrel and release the winder from the spring. And there you have it, our new mainspring inserted into our cleaned mainspring barrel. Occasionally when you put a mainspring into a barrel, especially if it's a new spring, it might kind of hang up on the lip of the inner rim. So you can just see I used a small screwdriver to push that over. The next step is to get the mainspring arbor into the barrel. Again, you got to be careful with a set of tweezers when you're putting that in, and make sure you put it in correctly. If you're taking a watch apart for the first time, take lots of pictures so that you know how each of these parts goes back in. They'll only work in one direction, so keep that in mind. The arbor winds the spring in a certain direction, the spring is put in a certain direction, and the watch will only work if the mainspring and the arbor are correctly inserted into the barrel. So now I've got the arbor in, we'll stick the cap back on. In this case I can put the cap on by hand, so I'm going to gently squeeze that. Now sometimes if you haven't pre-oiled the spring before you put the cap on, you want to put some oil on the mainspring. In this case the spring is pre-oiled before I put it in the winder, and that's enough. You don't want to over oil the mainspring. You can see earlier in this video how dirty they get if they're not well taken care of. Once that's set, we can begin the process of reinserting the mainspring barrel into the watch and inserting all the parts again. We're going to put those back in the opposite order that we remove them all. So here we put the barrel in. The screw hole for the winding clutch goes on top. We're going to put the plate, the mainspring plate, back in place. Grab the screws for that plate. Make sure they're the same screws. Put them in place. Remembering not to squeeze too hard with your tweezers, because again, those little screws can pop out of tweezers and travel 20 feet across a room. So here I'm going to start the process of putting the screw in. We'll go on to the next screw and we'll tighten everything down. I don't like to tighten one screw before I've inserted all the screws in each plate, just to make sure that the parts are fitting correctly. I'm not going to cause any damage. Now the second screw gets tightened in. And once that's in place, I'll make sure both screws are tight. Not too tight, but tight enough to hold all the pieces together for a good long time, years hopefully. And the reason you want to make sure they're tight enough but not over tight, a loose screw over time, the customer's wearing the watch, if there's a loose screw in it, it'll actually come undone. And if a screw starts flying around inside a watch, it can cause a great deal of trouble for the watch. Sometimes can even break some parts. I've had a few screws get stuck under a balance wheel and actually cause some damage to a hairspring or even break a balance staff. So you want to make sure that everything's tight in place, but again, not over tight, because these small screws will break easy. Here I'm getting the gear, the winding gear in place, and I'm just making sure it's in there correctly. Now we'll grab the cap screw for that. We'll get that in place. And once I get this screwed down, you'll notice that as I turn it, the mainspring gets a little tension and all the gears in the train will start to turn a little bit. And that's normal, and we want to see that. I can hold that one gear down and tighten that screw up just a little bit. That way I make sure that it's not going to fall out. And here I'm just winding it and giving it a quick test to make sure that the train is turning freely. And it is, and there's no skipping, there's not a problem here. I'm just going to get my fingerprints off that. Now we're going to move on to the next part, which is the pallet. So we're going to grab the pallet fork next, and we're going to get that set into place. Now in this particular case, I re-cleaned the pallet fork and the pallet plate, and I also re-cleaned the hairspring. I re-cleaned the balance staff and the balance cock, so that everything was actually going to be in good shape when I put it back in. You don't necessarily have to do that on a clean watch, but it's not my watch, it's the customer's watch. We want it to work good, and I want to get the beat back to normal. So because I've taken these parts out, I thought it was a good idea to clean them. Here we're going to grab the pallet plate and we're going to put that in position. Make sure that you get it set right. Now you have to be very conscious of the pinion on the pallet fork so that it goes into the jewels without doing any damage. So when you get everything set, I like to get one screw in but rather loose. I'll take a look at it under the microscope and make sure that everything's fine, that I haven't done any damage, or no damage is going to be caused when I tighten everything up. Because the pinion on a pallet fork can actually crack either one of the cap jewels on top or above it very easily when you tighten it down. Pallet forks on a Rolex of this type can cost about $150, so you want to be careful with those. This is probably one of the parts that I take my most time with, getting it set into place. And here you can see I'm tightening it up very, very cautiously, and I've already looked at it under the microscope, so at this time I know that everything's good. I'm just going to give a little dab of oil onto the pallet, and that way we make sure that there's smooth operation during the rest of the assembly. The next step is to insert the balance staff and the balance cock. Obviously they're attached already, so we're going to line that pallet fork up and then put the balance staff in the appropriate direction. Take your time. Don't worry about forcing it. Once it's in place, almost always will start working on its own, and sometimes you'll see that balance staff or that balance wheel just start oscillating back and forth without an issue. I'm coming in at a little bit different angle on the second attempt, and I'm just going to gently put one side of the balance cock in place, slide the other end over, and then just ever so gently touch the balance staff and see if it takes off. And there we go. Again, this is another critical part. You want to insert the 2 screws for the balance cock very gently. We don't want those to fall into the balance wheel, so you want to get those straight into their alignment holes, and then gently tighten them ever so slowly to make sure that they fall into place and hold the cock in place without doing damage to the balance staff. Once the first screw is in place, we can move on to the second screw and get that in place. Now, occasionally, if the balance wheel hasn't been cleaned properly, or if there's an issue at this point, as soon as we tighten the second screw down, and I do this very slowly, if I start to see resistance in the balance wheel and its oscillation, I will immediately remove the screws and start over just to make sure. Now, I've got the 2 screws set in place, and you can see I'm adjusting the beat indicator, or the regulator for the beat, and that's to get the balance jewel aligned with the pallet fork, and we covered that in a different video, so you kind of can go back and look at that and see what else I've done with the alignment of balance jewels and pallet forks. Here I'm taking my beat rate machine and I'm putting the sensor onto the balance cock, and it's counting the beats per hour. And what I want to get to is the regulated standard amount of beats per hour for this particular watch. Once I get to that point, I want to see how consistent it is. I can move that regulator arm back and forth just ever so slightly to get to a point where my beats per hour is perfect. In a Rolex, we don't have a speed regulator. It's self-regulating, so that means all the parts are manufactured to run at a specific rate. On other watches, mostly Swiss, there's a speed regulator. Well guys, that's pretty much it. That's how I change a mainspring in a barrel. Normally, it's done with the watch fully disassembled out of the case. In this particular case, the customer wanted to save some money. He didn't want to pay for another full service, so we did pretty much the full mainspring replacement without removing the watch from the case, and I wanted to show you it can be done. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. I could use all the likes I can get on these videos. I appreciate making them for you guys, and if you want to see anything in particular, please send me a message, let me know. I'll do my best to take as many videos of repairs as I can. And that's it for this video, guys. Give it a thumbs up if you liked the video, and let me know what you think. If you want to support my coffee habit, the production of these videos and its editing, you can support us on Patreon. We are viewer funded, so any little bit helps. And I want you all to have a great day, and I hope 2019 treats you all as well as I hope it treats me. Take care. Happy watchmaking.